I used to think the worst thing you could inherit was silence, the kind that follows when someone leaves without explanation. I was wrong. The worst thing is discovering they never left at all, that they were screaming the entire time, and you just couldn't hear them. This is the story of how I learned to breathe underwater. How I found my father in 85 feet of water, 20 years after he disappeared. And how the truth he died protecting became the only heir I needed. He was a man who had lost everything: his career, his family, his place in the world, until he inherited nothing but a waterlogged shipping container and a rusted diving helmet. What he discovered inside wouldn't just rebuild his life. It would resurrect a legacy the ocean had tried to bury. If you've ever felt like the tide washed away everything you were building, I need you to tell you this. Stay with me. This story is for anyone who's ever had to start over when starting over felt impossible. The conference room smelled of recycled air and anxiety. It was the kind of sterile environment designed to make bad news feel official, where the hum of fluorescent lights replaced the sound of human breathing. I sat in a plastic chair that creaked with every shift of my weight, the seat still warm from the previous occupant. Through the glass wall, I could see the employment office floor, rows of identical desks where people like me came to prove they were still trying. I hadn't worn a suit in 3 years. The jacket hung loose on my frame, thrift store wool scratching against skin that had grown accustomed to canvas and salt. My tie, a clip-on I'd found in a donation bin, felt like a noose. The woman across the folding table had the exhausted patience of someone who had delivered this speech too many times today. "Mr. Vance," she said, not unkindly, "as I've explained, your unemployment benefits have reached the maximum extension. The maritime industry hasn't shown sufficient recovery to qualify for the federal extension program." I nodded. I'd been expecting this. The fishing boats weren't hiring. The cargo lines had automated. The offshore rigs had gone quiet after the last environmental review. I was 42 years old, and my only marketable skill, knowing the ocean the way a man knows his own heartbeat, had become as obsolete as the sextant my father had taught me to use. "There is one matter, however," she continued, shuffling papers. "We received notification from a probate attorney in Key West. Apparently, your father listed you as a beneficiary in his estate." The word hit me like a rogue wave. Father. I hadn't spoken it aloud in 15 years. Marcus Vance had been a ghost long before he became a corpse, a man who walked out of our Baltimore row house when I was 16, leaving nothing but the smell of pipe tobacco and a half-finished model ship in the basement. "He passed 7 months ago," the woman said, checking her notes. "The estate is unconventional. There's no property, no investments, no insurance, just the contents of a shipping container. Unit 4C at a marine storage facility in Stock Island. The lease is paid through the end of the year. After that," she shrugged, "the facility is being converted to condominium boat slips. You'll need to clear it by December 31st. She slid an envelope across the table. My name was written in blue ink, the handwriting shaky but unmistakable. I would have known it anywhere. Marcus Vance had sent me postcards from every port he'd ever visited, right up until the year I turned 18. Then they stopped. I assumed he'd stopped caring. Now I held proof he'd remembered my name. "That's it?" I asked. My voice came out rough, unused. "That's the entirety of the tangible estate, yes." The attorney included a note that your father requested you receive this letter at the same time as the container key. She paused, and for a moment her professional mask slipped. She saw something, maybe the tremor in my hand as I took the envelope, maybe the way my shoulders curled inward like a man bracing for impact. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mr. Vance." I walked out into the September heat. Baltimore's harbor glittered in the distance, the water the same gray-green as my father's eyes. I had $127 in my checking account, a room in a boarding house that took cash weekly, and a key to a metal box full of whatever a dead man thought was worth saving. I didn't know it yet, but that key wasn't just opening a shipping container. It was opening every door I'd been too afraid to knock on. The bus to Florida took 36 hours. I spent it pressed against the window, watching the country flatten and warm, the color palette shifting from rust belt brown to subtropical green. The envelope stayed in my jacket pocket, a rectangular weight against my ribs. I didn't open it. I told myself I was waiting for the right moment, but the truth was simpler. I was afraid of what I might find inside. My memories of Marcus Vance were tidal. They came in, they went out, they left debris behind. I remembered the smell of his workshop, salt, varnish, the particular mustiness of old charts. I remembered his hands, scarred and square, holding a pencil to plot a course. I remembered him teaching me to read the water. "Currents tell the truth, Eli," he'd said, his voice low and patient. "The surface lies. The surface is all wind and reflection. You want to know where you're going, you look beneath." And then I remembered him leaving, a Tuesday morning. My mother screaming in the kitchen, the sound of his boots on the porch steps, then the silence where his engine should have started. He'd walked to the marina. He'd taken the boat we'd rebuilt together, the Meredith Jane, named for my mother. He'd never said goodbye. My mother died 5 years later, cancer, the kind that moves fast and leaves no hope. I joined the Merchant Marine because it was the only way I could think of to follow him. I spent 20 years on cargo ships and fishing trawlers, always looking at the horizon, always wondering if the next port would be the one where I'd find him. I never did. The Meredith Jane had been sold in Nassau in 1998. Marcus Vance had vanished into the registry of maritime ghosts, men who exist on paper but nowhere else. The bus deposited me in Key West at dawn. The air smelled of diesel and blooming jasmine. I walked the 2 miles to Stock Island, my duffel bag cutting into my shoulder, the heat building with every step. The marine storage facility squatted on a spit of land between the highway and the mangroves, a graveyard of shipping containers painted in fading colors, stacked in rows that seemed to lean toward the water. The office was a trailer with a hand-painted sign, "See Manager for Access," back by 9 a.m. It was 6:30. The sun was still low enough to cast long shadows between the containers. I found 4C at the end of a row near the water's edge. The container was standard height, but weathered to the color of old bone. Rust bloomed along the bottom edges, eating into the metal. The locking bar was secured with a modern disc lock, but the key in my envelope was an old skeleton key. Brass, heavy, the kind that opened trunks and chests, not shipping containers. For a moment I thought it was a mistake, a final joke. Then I noticed the hasp itself was loose, the screws corroded. I gripped it and pulled. The entire locking mechanism came away in my hand, revealing a second, older lock underneath. A brass padlock green with verdigris, the keyhole the right size for what I held. The skeleton key turned smoothly. The lock snapped open with a sound like a bone breaking. I gripped the container's locking bars and heaved. The door groaned, resisted, then gave way. Darkness inside, and then the smell hit me. Not rot, not decay, but the unmistakable scent of a working vessel. Salt, oil, wood, the particular mustiness of charts stored in humid air. My eyes adjusted. The container wasn't packed with junk. It was transformed. The interior had been fitted with walls of salvaged teak. A chart table ran along one side, its surface covered in glass to protect the maps underneath. Shelves lined the other wall, stacked with logbooks, their spines labeled in my father's handwriting. 1987-1992, Caribbean Basin. 1993-1999, Atlantic Crossing. 2000-2008, Pacific Routes. And in the center, placed deliberately on a pedestal of stacked nautical almanacs, was the diving helmet. It was antique brass and copper, the faceplate dark with tarnish. A note was taped to the crown, written on the same heavy paper as the envelope in my pocket. For Eli, open first. I sat on the floor of the container, my back against the teak wall, and finally opened my father's letter. My son, if you're reading this, then the ocean finally caught up with me. I'm sorry for that. I'm sorry for more than you know. I need you to understand something before you go further. I didn't leave because I wanted to. I left because I had to, and I couldn't tell you why. I still can't, not directly. The men I was running from had resources, patience, ways of finding people who talked. If you're reading this, they're probably still looking, so I'll be careful. I made a mistake in 1998. I took a salvage job in the Bahamas, recovering cargo from a wreck in Exuma Sound. What I found down there wasn't cargo, it was evidence. A plane intact sitting in 80 feet of water. Inside, documents, cash, weapons. The kind of things people kill to keep hidden. I was naive. I reported it to the authorities. The wrong authorities, as it turned out. Within a week, I had men watching the house. Within 2, they made their first threat, not against me, against you, against your mother. I couldn't go to the police. The people involved owned the police. I couldn't fight them. I didn't have the resources or the evidence. All I could do was disappear. Become the kind of ghost they couldn't use as leverage. I told your mother everything. She agreed it was the only way to keep you safe. We staged the fight. I took the boat. I became a man without a past, moving from port to port, working under assumed names, always watching, always ready to run if they found me. But I never stopped being your father. I just had to do it from a distance. The helmet contains everything, the coordinates of the wreck, copies of the documents I recovered, names, dates, account numbers. Enough to destroy the people who threatened us if it ever goes public. I couldn't use it while I was alive. They were always watching, but dead, I'm beyond their reach. And you're a ghost they never knew existed. They watched me for 15 years, Eli. I never contacted you because I couldn't risk them connecting us, but I watched. I know about the Merchant Marine. I know about your mother's death. I know you're struggling now. This container is everything I built in exile. The charts are real. I've spent 20 years mapping currents no one else has documented, finding routes through waters the cruise lines haven't discovered. The logbooks contain enough original data to establish you as an authority. The diving gear is professional grade, maintained, ready. But more than that, there's a life here. A way of being in the world that doesn't require you to fit into their systems. I've left you the tools to work independently, to chart your own course, literally and figuratively. The container lease ends December 31st. The facility is being demolished for condos. You need to decide what to do with all this. You can sell the equipment, walk away with enough to start over somewhere else, or you can finish what I started. There's one more thing. The wreck in Exuma Sound, it's still there. The evidence is still there. I've spent 20 years building the case, documenting the network, waiting for the right moment. That moment is now. The organization has weakened. Key people have died. The new leadership doesn't know about the plane, doesn't know I kept copies. You could dive it. You could surface the truth. It wouldn't bring me back, but it would clear my name. And yours. Because the lie I told, that I abandoned you, has been living in you like a parasite. I know it has. I watched you from afar, saw you build walls, saw you choose isolation because it felt safer than connection. I'm asking you to tear down those walls. Not for me. For you. The helmet is yours. The choice is yours. Whatever you decide, know that I never stopped loving you. I never stopped being proud of you. I just had to love you from a distance, the way you love a horizon, always present, always out of reach. Your father, Marcus, I read the letter 3 times. The container had grown hot, the morning sun beating against the metal, but I was shaking with cold. Everything I believed about my life, Every narrative I'd constructed about abandonment, about unworthiness, about the inevitability of being left, was a lie built to protect me. The rage came first. Hot, familiar, directed at the phantom men who had dictated the terms of my childhood. Then the grief, vast and tidal, for the years I'd spent hating a man who had sacrificed everything to keep me safe. Then, finally, something else, a strange, terrifying sense of possibility. I opened the diving helmet. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were the documents my father had described, photographs of the wreck, copied ledgers, a handwritten map of the underwater site. And beneath them, a key to a marina slip in Marathon where a boat waited. The second chance, the registration read, a 34-foot sloop equipped for extended cruising, paid in full. I spent that first day in a daze, touching objects my father had touched, reading entries in logbooks that spanned decades. He'd been everywhere, the Solomon Islands, the Azores, the coast of Maine. He'd worked as a charter captain, a salvage diver, a consultant for documentary filmmakers. He'd built a life from the wreckage of his old one, just as he'd described, and he'd documented everything. The charts on the table weren't copies. They were originals, drawn by hand, showing current patterns and depth soundings no commercial service had recorded. He'd found a purpose in mapping the unmapped, in knowing the ocean better than the people who were trying to exploit it. I found the last entry in the final logbook, dated 3 weeks before his death. Eli is in Baltimore. The fishing industry has collapsed. He's looking for work on cargo ships again, but the automation is killing those jobs. I want to reach out. I want to tell him everything, but the surveillance has increased. New people in the network more aggressive. I can't risk connecting us now, not when I'm so close to finishing. He'll inherit everything. He'll understand. He'll have choices I never had, I hope. I slept in the container that night, on a cot I found folded behind the chart table. The metal walls trapped the heat, but I didn't mind. For the first time in years, I felt enclosed by something other than my own fear. The next morning, I started making plans. I had 3 months to empty the container. 3 months to process 20 years of hidden life. 3 months to decide whether I was the kind of man who surfaced the truth or the kind who walked away. I started with the charts. My father's handwriting was precise, architectural, each depth sounding, noted with the care of a man who understood that accuracy was survival. I spent a week just reading, learning his system, understanding the patterns he'd discovered. The Caribbean currents he'd mapped could save fuel costs for any charter operation. The Pacific routes he'd documented opened passages that the cruising guides claimed were impassable. This was valuable. This was a career, if I wanted it. Independent charter work, consulting for the documentary industry, maybe a book. My father had built me an escape route from the employment office, from the plastic chairs and the fluorescent lights. But the wreck haunted me, Exuma Sound, the plane, the evidence that could clear his name. I found his research on the organization, names, connections, a network diagram that sprawled across 3 pages. It was a criminal enterprise masquerading as a legitimate business. Import-export, real estate development, political influence. The plane had been carrying documents linking them to arms trafficking, money laundering, the funding of coups in 3 countries. My father had stumbled into something that had destroyed governments. And they were still active, weaker, as he'd said, but still dangerous. The new leadership, he'd named them, described them, wouldn't want the plane found, wouldn't want the documents surfaced. I spent September organizing. I rented a small apartment in Marathon, near the boat. I transferred the charts and logbooks to climate-controlled storage. I sold some of the older diving equipment. Vintage gear collectors paid surprising amounts, and used the money to outfit the second chance for the voyage I was planning. The boat was perfect. My father had maintained her obsessively. New standing rigging, updated electronics, a diesel that purred like something wild. The cabin was sparse but functional, every storage locker labeled in his handwriting. Spare impeller, emergency water, Eli's charts. He'd been preparing for me. For years, he'd been preparing for me. I found the last letter on October 1st, tucked into the navigation station where he knew I'd find it. It was dated 2 days before his death. Eli, if you're reading this, you've found the boat. You've probably found the wreck research. You're wondering whether to dive it. I can't tell you what to do. I can only tell you what I learned in 20 years of running. The truth doesn't set you free. It just gives you different problems. Surfacing the plane will be dangerous. It will attract attention. It will force you to testify, to be public, to be visible in ways that will make you uncomfortable. But hiding is its own kind of death. I died a little every day I couldn't contact you. Every birthday I missed, every graduation I watched from a distance. I became a ghost to keep you safe, and in doing so, I lost the best parts of being alive. You have a choice I never had. The network is weaker. The key people are dead or in prison. You could dive the wreck, surface the documents, and probably survive. You'd clear my name. You'd get justice for your mother who lived with this secret until the day she died. Or you could sail away. Take the charts, build the charter business, live the life I built for you. That's not cowardice. That's wisdom. Sometimes survival is the victory, but I'll tell you what I think. I think you're angry. I think you've been angry for 15 years, and you never knew where to point it. I think diving that wreck would give that anger a target. I think building something new, something public, something connected would finish the work I couldn't complete. Whatever you choose, choose it actively. Don't drift. The worst thing you can do is let the current decide. I'm proud of you. I've always been proud of you. Now go make me prouder. I sailed for the Bahamas on October 15th. The crossing took 5 days. Perfect weather following seas. The kind of passage that feels like the ocean is welcoming you home. I spent the time reading my father's logs from the original discovery, learning the site, preparing my approach. Exuma Sound is a deep trench between the islands, a place where the water changes color from turquoise to indigo in the space of a boat length. The plane sat on a shelf at 85 feet. My father had written, just below recreational diving limits but accessible to a trained diver with the right equipment. I anchored the second chance in the lee of a small quay and spent a day preparing. The diving gear in the container had included a modern rebreather, expensive, military grade, the kind of equipment that let you stay down for hours without bubbles. My father had been planning this dive for years. I descended at dawn on the 5th day. The water was clear, 100-foot visibility, the reef alive with fish that scattered at my approach. I followed my father's coordinates, dropping down the wall until the color shifted to violet and the temperature dropped 10 degrees. I found it at 83 feet. A twin-engine aircraft, intact, sitting on the sand like a discarded toy. The fuselage was covered in growth, corals, sponges, the slow accumulation of 20 years, but recognizable. A cargo plane unmarked, the registration numbers filed away. The cargo door was open, just as my father had described. I swam inside, my light cutting through the gloom. The interior was empty of cargo now, salvaged or decayed or never there. But the cockpit was intact, and in the pilot's seat, still strapped in, were the remains of a man in a flight suit. And on the co-pilot's seat, a waterproof document case bolted to the frame. I surfaced with the case 3 hours later, my decompression stops measured in patience and hope. I didn't open it until I was back on the second chance, until I had sailed to a different anchorage, until I was sure I was alone. Inside, ledgers, account numbers, correspondence. Proof of everything my father had claimed. And something else, a photograph of my father, young, standing on a dock with a woman I didn't recognize. On the back in his handwriting, Meredith and Me, 1982, before Eli, before everything. My mother had been his second wife. There was a whole life before me, a whole person I never knew. The document case contained letters from this Meredith. Love letters, desperate letters, letters describing a plan to expose the network that had ended with her death. An accident, the official report said. A car crash. My father had been trying to finish what she'd started. Everything he'd done, leaving us, hiding, mapping the ocean, had been in her memory as much as mine. I sat in the cockpit of the Second Chance until sunset, reading. The anger I'd carried dissolved into something more complex. Grief for my father, yes, but also for this woman I'd never known, for the young man my father had been, for the decades of secret work that had consumed his life. And then finally, clarity. I knew what I had to do. I didn't surface the plane immediately. I spent November preparing, copying documents, establishing contacts, building the case my father had never been able to complete. I reached out to journalists, to federal investigators, to the families of other victims. I used my father's network diagram to understand who was still dangerous and who had already fallen. And I built something else. I started a charter business, not the independent operation my father had envisioned, but something more public. I called it Second Chance Sailing, and I specialized in the routes my father had mapped, the passages no one else would attempt. I hired local crew in every port. I partnered with marine research organizations, offering my father's current data to scientists studying climate change. I became visible. I became connected. I became the opposite of a ghost. The dive on the plane happened in early December, this time with witnesses, documentary filmmakers, federal agents, representatives from 3 governments. I led them down to the wreck, showed them the cockpit, the body, the history preserved in 85 feet of water. The case made headlines for a week. The network my father had exposed collapsed under the weight of the evidence. RICO charges, extraditions, a cascade of prosecutions that reached into 3 countries. My father's name appeared in the coverage. Marcus Vance, maritime investigator who died before he could testify. They called him a hero. They called him a whistleblower. They didn't know the half of it. I testified before a grand jury in January. I told them everything, my father's disappearance, his exile, the container in Stock Island, the inheritance he'd built in secret. I became public in ways that terrified me, but I survived. The network was broken, the danger had passed, the container facility was demolished on schedule. I watched from the Second Chance, anchored in the channel, as the cranes tore down the rows of metal boxes. I didn't mourn it. Everything worth saving had already been saved. The charts, the logs, the diving helmet that now sat in my navigation station, a reminder of where I'd come from. I spent the winter in the Bahamas, running charters, building the business. I hired a first mate, a woman named Sarah who'd left a corporate law job to learn sailing, who laughed at my father's jokes in the logbooks and asked questions about the routes, until I had to teach her to read the charts herself. We mapped a new passage together in March, a route through the Turks and Caicos that saved 12 hours on the run to the Virgins. I named it Marcus's Channel on the chart, and Sarah added it to the cruising guides we were updating. My father's work, continuing through new hands. In April, I finally sailed back to Baltimore. I hadn't been there in 3 years. The row house where I grew up was still standing, though the neighborhood had changed. Coffee shops where there had been vacant lots. Young professionals walking dogs my father would have recognized as purebred. I stood on the sidewalk and looked up at the window of my childhood bedroom. I thought about the boy who'd watched his father walk away, who'd spent decades believing he wasn't worth staying for. I thought about the man who'd actually left, scared, desperate, trying to protect something he loved more than his own life. I didn't go inside. There was nothing there for me anymore. The home I was building was elsewhere, on the water, in the charts, in the community of people who chose to move through the world rather than hide from it. I sailed for Key West that evening, following the current my father had mapped 30 years ago. The water was the color he loved, green shifting to blue, the surface lying about the depths beneath, the truth waiting for anyone brave enough to look. I want to pause here and speak to you directly. If you've made it this far, thank you. This story is about the narratives we inherit, the stories we're told about who we are, where we come from, what we're capable of. Sometimes those stories are lies built to protect us. Sometimes they're truths we weren't ready to hear. And sometimes, if we're lucky, we get the chance to rewrite them. Have you ever discovered that a fundamental truth about your life was wrong? That a parent, a partner, a friend was acting from love when you thought they were acting from indifference? It's disorienting. It can feel like the floor dropping away. But it can also be liberating. It can give you permission to stop being the person you thought you had to be. If this resonates, if you've ever had to rebuild your understanding of your own past, I'd love to hear about it. The comments section is open. This community is for people who know that the deepest currents are the ones that run beneath the surface. Now, back to the story. I spent the next 3 years building Second Chance Sailing into something my father would have recognized. We expanded to 3 boats, all named for people who'd chosen second acts. The Meredith, after the woman who'd started my father's crusade. The Elia's my full name, which I'd never used until I saw it on a transom, and the Marcus, which I captained myself. Sarah became my partner in business, in navigation, in life. We mapped 2 more passages, published a book of my father's charts, established a foundation to support independent maritime research. We became the kind of people who gave others the chances we'd been given. The diving helmet stayed in my navigation station. I used it sometimes when the work was hard, when the old fears resurfaced. I'd hold it and remember that my father had held it, that he'd prepared it for me, that he'd believed I was capable of things I hadn't yet imagined. In the end, that's what I inherited. Not the money, though there was enough, from the salvage rights and the documentary deals and the book sales. Not the equipment, though I used it every day. Not even the truth about my past, though that had set me free in ways I'm still understanding. I inherited belief. The absolute, unwavering conviction that I could become something other than what the world had told me I was. That I could build a life from wreckage, chart a course through impossible waters, surface the truth even when it was dangerous. My father spent 20 years as a ghost so that I could become fully alive. I honor that sacrifice not by mourning him, but by continuing his work, mapping the unmapped, connecting the isolated, believing in the possibility of second chances. The last entry in his final logbook, the one I found after I'd testified, after the network had fallen, after I'd begun to build, Eli will be fine. Eli will be better than fine. Eli will be the man I couldn't be, public, connected, fearless. I don't regret the years I lost. I invested them. And now, finally, I get to see the return. He wrote that 3 days before he died. He knew somehow that I would find everything, that I would understand, that I would choose to build rather than hide. I keep that logbook in the chart table of the Marcus. I add to it now my handwriting alongside his, continuing the record. The currents we mapped together, the passages we opened, the lives we touched. Sometimes in the morning, when the water is flat and the world feels possible, I take the diving helmet out and hold it up to the light. The brass is polished to a warm glow, the faceplate clear, the whole thing heavy with memory and hope. It looks like what it is, a way to breathe underwater. A way to survive in depths that should kill you. A way to see the truth that lies beneath the surface lie. That's what I want to leave you with. Sometimes the things we inherit look like burdens. A rusted helmet, a waterlogged container, a story of abandonment. But if we have the courage to open them, to read the letters, to dive the wrecks, we might find they're not burdens at all. They're invitations. They're equipment for the work we're meant to do. They're second chances, delivered across time and silence, from people who loved us enough to plan for futures they wouldn't see. The story of my life isn't about what was taken from me anymore. It's about what I've decided to build, what I've decided to surface, what I've decided to become. If you have a story about finding something unexpected in the wreckage, literal or metaphorical, I want to hear it. Share it below. Let's make this a place where we celebrate the courage to dive deep, to surface truth, to build homes in waters everyone else calls impassable. Thank you for listening. There are so many more stories to chart.